The night air hung heavy over the island, thick with the scent of salt and damp foliage. The crashing waves against the rugged Maui coastline were a familiar lullaby, but on this particular night, something was off. The usual tranquility seemed disturbed, as if the very air carried an unspoken warning. Carly Charlie Scott drove along the darkened highway, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. The glow from her dashboard cast a pale light across her face, highlighting the concern etched in her eyes. She was 5 months pregnant, her body beginning to show the undeniable curve of impending motherhood. And yet, here she was, driving alone into the night, responding to a call for help from the man who had distanced himself the moment he learned of the baby. Stephen Capobianco, her ex-boyfriend, the father of her child. The call had been unexpected. His voice had been flat, unhurried, yet there was a tension beneath it. He claimed his truck had broken down near Kenai, a remote area on the island's eastern coast. It was late, too late for a casual favor, but Charlie, ever trusting, ever willing to help, didn't hesitate. Perhaps this was a chance for him to step up, to acknowledge the life they had created together. Perhaps this was the beginning of something different. But as the miles stretched behind her, the weight in her chest grew heavier. The road wound through dense forests, where shadows played tricks on the mind. The headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the towering trees that lined the way. There were no streetlights, no passing cars, only the narrow stretch of pavement leading deeper into the wilderness. The closer she got to Kenai, the more isolated it became. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, a message from her younger sister, Fiona. "Where are you? Mom's worried." Charlie glanced at it but didn't reply. She would be back soon. She would explain everything in the morning. Up ahead, a set of taillights flickered in the distance. The sight of Stephen's truck parked on the side of the road brought a momentary sense of relief. He had said he needed help. She was here now. She pulled over, stepping out of the car. The night air was colder than she expected, wrapping around her like an unwelcome presence. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs below. Stephen was standing by the hood of his truck, hands in his pockets, his posture unreadable in the dim light. She called out his name, but he didn't immediately respond. There was something about the way he stood there, unmoving, staring at her in the half-darkness. The weight in her chest pressed down harder. Somewhere in the vast, empty night, a chill ran through her spine. She had made a mistake. The morning air on Maui carried a deceptive sense of peace. Waves crashed rhythmically against the rocky shores, and the scent of salt mixed with damp earth lingered in the early light. But inside the Scott household, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Kimberlyn Scott stood in her kitchen, phone in hand, staring at the screen. The small digital numbers displayed the time, far later than Charlie should have been home. Her fingers hovered over the dial button, debating whether she was overreacting. But deep in her gut, an unease had begun to settle, gnawing at her like an itch she couldn't ignore. She had already tried calling her daughter 3 times that morning. Each attempt had gone straight to voicemail. That wasn't like Charlie. Fiona entered the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, still groggy from sleep. She glanced at her mother and immediately noticed the worry in her expression. "She's not home yet?" Kimberlyn shook her head, a tightness forming in her chest. "I tried calling. Nothing." It wasn't just the lack of response that concerned her. Charlie had always been responsible, even when things in her life weren't perfect. And now she was 5 months pregnant. There was no way she would simply disappear without telling someone where she was. Fiona frowned. Did she say anything last night? Where she was going? The question jolted something in Kimberlyn's memory, a conversation from the night before. She was helping Stephen. Fiona's face twisted slightly. Stephen? As in Stephen? Her tone carried the same unspoken apprehension that Kimberlyn felt. Kimberlyn grabbed her phone again, this time dialing a different number. It rang. Once. Twice. Then finally. "Hello." Stephen Capobianco's voice was flat, uninterested. "Stephen, have you seen Charlie?" A pause. "Yeah, she came by last night. Helped me with my truck." "And then?" "She left." "Where did she go?" "I don't know. She was heading home, I guess." His answers were clipped, as if the conversation bored him. That was the first thing that didn't sit right. Kimberlyn pushed harder. Are you sure? She hasn't come home. She's not answering her phone. Silence, then, I don't know what to tell you. She left. There was something off about the way he said it. Cold. Detached. Kimberlyn's fingers tightened around her phone. Charlie would have been home by now. She should have called back. Something was wrong. By noon, when no one had seen or heard from Charlie, fear turned into action. Kimberlyn called the police. My daughter is missing. The Maui Police Department responded quickly, sending officers to gather information. Missing persons cases were always tricky. Sometimes people left on their own, only to return a few days later. But there were details about this one that made it different. Charlie was pregnant, 5 months along. She wasn't someone who would just walk away from her life. The officers started with the usual questions. When was the last time she was seen? What was she wearing? Did she mention anything unusual before she disappeared? Kimberlyn relayed everything she knew, her voice tight with worry. She was wearing jeans, a hoodie. She left late last night to help Stephen with his truck. Stephen. The name was noted, and before long, officers were knocking on his door. He answered quickly, eyes unreadable, his posture relaxed. Yeah, I saw her last night, he said. She helped me fix my truck, and then she left. A familiar answer, word for word. The officer asked, Do you know where she was headed? Stephen shrugged. Home, I assume. Did you see her leave? Not really, I was busy finishing up. What time was this? Late, maybe around 11. The officer studied him for a moment. His face gave nothing away. Did she seem upset? Worried? No. The questions continued, but his answers remained the same. Short, detached, almost rehearsed. There was no urgency, no concern, no sign that he found it odd that the mother of his unborn child had vanished after leaving his presence. For now, there was nothing more the officers could do. Charlie was missing, but there was no sign of foul play. Yet. Back at the Scott home, the family refused to wait. By early afternoon, they had gathered friends and volunteers to begin searching along the Hana Highway, the most likely route Charlie would have taken home. Hours passed with no sign of her. Then just off the road, someone spotted something in the underbrush. A piece of fabric. Torn. Dirty. Kimberlyn's breath caught in her throat. She knew that pattern. It was Charlie's. The discovery set off a frenzy. Searchers fanned out, combing through the dense terrain. More items surfaced. Small, scattered belongings. A blanket. A strand of red hair clinging to a broken branch. The air grew heavy with dread. And then, the worst discovery of all. Charlie's car. Burned. Completely destroyed. Hidden off the main road near a steep incline. There was no sign of her inside. But the fire had not been accidental. Someone had tried to make something disappear. And suddenly this was no longer just a missing persons case. This was something far, far worse. The charred remains of Charlie Scott's Toyota 4Runner stood as a grim testament to a night that had spiraled into something unthinkable. It was unrecognizable, the fire having stripped it of its once familiar shape, reducing it to twisted metal and scorched rubber. The interior had been gutted, the seats burned down to their skeletal frames, the dashboard melted into a misshapen form. The air around the vehicle still carried the faint, acrid stench of smoke and burned material, as if the destruction had only recently settled into silence. Officers and forensic specialists moved carefully around the wreckage, snapping photos, marking evidence, searching for anything that could speak to what had happened. It was clear that the fire had not been a natural occurrence. Someone had set it, and if someone had set it, there was a reason why. Detective Lieutenant William Juan, one of the senior investigators on the case, observed the scene with a heavy frown. He had seen enough to know that this was no accident. Cars didn't just spontaneously combust and conveniently end up abandoned in remote areas. If the vehicle had been involved in a crash, there would have been impact damage, a trail, something to indicate an attempt to stop. But there was none of that. It had been placed here, hidden, torched, a calculated effort to erase something, possibly someone. As officers carefully combed the area, one of them called out, signaling for Juan to come closer. A short distance away from the vehicle, tangled in the brush, lay something small but unmistakable. A piece of fabric, torn, dirt-streaked, and partially singed. It was the same pattern found earlier in the day, the same material that Charlie had last been seen wearing. Juan's expression darkened. This was bad. When they expanded the search, more scattered evidence began to emerge. Fragments of clothing, strands of red hair, small personal items that appeared to have been hastily discarded. It was as if they were following a fragmented trail, leading them deeper into a reality they weren't ready to confront. Then came the discovery that caused the air to shift, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Near the base of a steep drop, partially concealed beneath a tangle of debris, was a piece of bone. It was small, not immediately identifiable, but human in appearance. A crime scene investigator crouched beside it, carefully documenting before collecting the fragment. The reality was setting in. This was no longer a case of a missing woman. It was a crime scene. Back at the station, the findings were reviewed in detail. The initial forensic analysis of the burned-out vehicle confirmed what they already suspected. It had been deliberately set on fire. Traces of an accelerant were detected in multiple areas, particularly concentrated around the seats and undercarriage. Someone had wanted the fire to consume as much as possible, to destroy evidence, to make sure no one could piece together what had happened inside. The officers turned their attention back to Stephen Capobianco. His was the last known face Charlie had seen. His truck was the destination she had driven toward, and now she was nowhere to be found. They needed to talk to him again. Capobianco did not appear rattled when the officers arrived at his home once more. He opened the door casually, greeting them with the same unaffected demeanor. When asked if he would come down to the station for further questioning, he didn't hesitate. At the station, he was seated in a stark, windowless room. The dim fluorescent lighting cast a pale glow over the metal table in front of him. The walls were bare, void of anything that might make the space feel less suffocating. Detective Juan entered the room, a file in hand. He set it down, flipping it open, revealing photos from the crime scene. Charlie's burned-out car, the scattered clothing, the evidence that painted a grim picture. "You said Charlie left on her own?" Juan began, his voice even, measured. "That was the last time you saw her?" Capobianco nodded. "Yeah, she left after helping me with my truck." "What time was that?" "Like I said before, late, around 11. Juan's eyes lingered on him, as if weighing his words carefully. "And you went straight home after that?" "Yeah." "You didn't see anyone else that night? Didn't go anywhere else?" "Nope." The detective tapped a finger against the photo of the burned vehicle. "Charlie's car was found torched. You aware of that?" Capobianco's gaze flickered briefly to the image, but his expression remained neutral. "Yeah, I heard." Juan leaned forward slightly. "You got any idea how that happened?" A shrug. "No clue." For a moment, there was only silence, the air in the room thick with an unspoken challenge. Juan finally leaned back, closing the file. "Stephen, here's the thing. A woman doesn't just vanish into thin air, and a car doesn't just catch fire and end up abandoned on the side of the road. Something happened to Charlie. Something happened to her car. And right now, you're the last person known to have seen her." Capobianco didn't flinch. "I told you everything I know." It wasn't what he said that bothered Juan. It was how he said it. The complete absence of concern, the utter lack of urgency. There was no fear, no grief, no frustration. It was as if the entire situation was just another minor inconvenience. But lack of emotion wasn't evidence. Not yet. For now, all they had were suspicions. And suspicions wouldn't hold up in court. The detectives released him. But they weren't letting this go. The search for Charlie was far from over. And the deeper they dug, the more unsettling the picture became. In the coming days, forensic results would confirm what everyone feared. The bone fragment found near the vehicle was human, and the bloodstains collected from various items recovered near the scene, a match for Charlie Scott. This was no longer just a missing persons case. This was a murder investigation. The weight of uncertainty had begun to suffocate the island. What had started as a missing persons case had now become something far worse, something that was no longer whispered about in private, but openly discussed in hushed, uneasy tones. The disappearance of Charlie Scott was no longer just a story. It was an unfolding tragedy, one that carried the unshakable scent of death. In the days following the discovery of her burned-out vehicle, law enforcement had intensified their search. But what they were finding wasn't hope, it was evidence. Each fragment uncovered painted a picture of violence, of finality. A case that had once teetered between possibilities was now tilting unmistakably toward a singular, grim conclusion. Charlie Scott had not simply vanished, she had been taken, and whoever had taken her had gone to great lengths to ensure she was never found. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, analyzing every piece of material recovered from the area where her car had been discovered. The small bone fragment sent to the crime lab had yielded results no one wanted to hear: human. And the blood found on the scattered clothing and along the ground near where the vehicle had been burned confirmed what many had feared. It was Charlie's. With each new discovery, the line between suspicion and certainty blurred. The public, once clinging to the hope that she might be alive somewhere, now began to shift their focus. Conversations that had once included questions about where Charlie might have gone now turned to who had done this to her. And the name on everyone's lips was the same: Stephen Capobianco. His was the name tied to the last known sighting. His was the voice that had called Charlie out that night. His was the face that had shown no concern, no fear, no urgency. And now his was the story that was starting to fall apart. Detectives had brought him in for questioning again, this time not as a concerned party, but as someone standing in the shadow of something undeniably sinister. His demeanor had remained the same: calm, indifferent, even slightly irritated at having to answer the same questions over and over. But it was no longer just his words that were under scrutiny, it was his timeline. His claims had been simple. Charlie had come to help him, she had left, and that was the last he had seen of her. But as investigators pieced together surveillance footage, cell tower data, and the accounts of those who had seen or spoken to him around the time of her disappearance, gaps began to appear. Gaps that weren't just inconsistencies but impossibilities. His truck had been seen in locations he hadn't mentioned. His phone had pinged off towers far from where he claimed to have been. The night that Charlie disappeared, Stephen Capobianco had not simply gone home. The evidence was stacking against him, but it was not yet enough to place him in handcuffs. That was the frustration of cases like these: knowing, but not yet being able to prove. Charlie's family was crumbling under the weight of their grief. Her mother, Kimberlyn, had transitioned from desperate hope to exhausted devastation. The search efforts had become less about finding Charlie alive and more about recovering what was left of her. The air in Maui had changed. The community, once known for its beauty and tranquility, had become heavy with suspicion. People were afraid, not necessarily afraid for their own safety, but afraid of what had happened in the dark corners of their own home, afraid that something monstrous had walked among them, hidden beneath a familiar face. The media had begun circling like vultures. News stations picked up the case, their headlines growing more ominous by the day. Pregnant woman vanishes, fiery clues point to foul play. Ex-boyfriend's alibi in question as blood evidence mounts. And yet, through all of it, Stephen remained unmoved. He did not plead for Charlie's return. He did not insert himself into the search. He did not stand in front of cameras and beg for answers. He stayed silent, and silence in the face of something like this was deafening. Then a new lead broke the case open further. A man who had been out on the remote roads of Maui on the night Charlie vanished came forward with a statement. He had seen something he had not initially thought much of, but now could not shake from his mind. He had seen a truck, similar to Stephen's, parked off the road near where Charlie's vehicle would later be found. He had seen movement, two figures, one standing, one kneeling, and then, just as quickly, he had seen nothing at all as the night swallowed them whole. The lead was crucial, but it was not yet enough. Detectives needed something undeniable, something that could not be explained away. So they pressed harder. They re-examined Stephen's truck, searching for anything that could tie him definitively to that night. What they found sent a fresh wave of horror through the department. A single, long, reddish strand of hair. It had been wedged in a crevice of the vehicle's interior, almost too small to notice. But it was there, and it was Charlie's. That was the moment everything shifted. Stephen Capobianco had claimed that Charlie had left him that night. He had claimed she had driven off, never to be seen again. But Charlie's hair had been inside his truck. She had been inside, and now there was no denying that she had never made it out alive. The discovery of Charlie Scott's hair inside Stephen Capobianco's truck had shifted the investigation into new territory. No longer was this just a case of a missing woman. This was now an undeniable confirmation that Charlie had been inside that vehicle at some point during the night of her disappearance. The implications were staggering. If Charlie had left Stephen's presence as he claimed, if she had driven away in her own vehicle, then why was a piece of her inside his truck? The logical answer was as chilling as it was damning. She had never left that vehicle of her own will. The air around the case thickened. What had started as a growing cloud of suspicion had now solidified into something far more substantial. The weight of the evidence was pressing down, and law enforcement could feel it. Detectives had been patient, meticulous, building their case piece by piece, knowing that when the time came, they would only have one shot at getting it right. Forensic analysts pored over every inch of Stephen's truck, knowing that a single misstep could mean the difference between speculation and a conviction. The strands of Charlie's hair weren't just present. They were lodged deep into crevices that indicated struggle, entrapment. They weren't the type of strands that might have drifted in from casual contact. They had been forced there by movement, by friction. Then came another discovery. Deep in the fibers of the upholstery, where it would have been nearly invisible to the naked eye, forensic specialists uncovered traces of blood. It was faint, so faint that without advanced forensic techniques it might have gone unnoticed, but it was there, and preliminary testing suggested that it was human. The sample was small, degraded, but it was something. If DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Charlie, there would be no alternative explanations left to entertain. Stephen Capobianco was running out of places to hide. Despite this, he remained eerily unshaken. He had been called in for questioning again, and if he knew the walls were closing in, he didn't show it. He answered with the same indifference, the same dismissive tone, as though the entire situation was nothing more than an inconvenience. But his answers were beginning to contradict themselves. Detectives had noticed it before, the slight inconsistencies, the way he phrased things just a little too carefully. But now they were undeniable. When questioned about his whereabouts after Charlie supposedly left that night, his timeline didn't quite add up. The records from his phone indicated movement long after he had claimed to be home. His truck had been seen in areas he hadn't mentioned. And now they had forensic evidence tying Charlie to the very place he insisted she hadn't been. They weren't ready to arrest him yet, but they were getting close. In the background, the Scott family was crumbling under the weight of it all. They had started this nightmare clinging to the fragile hope that Charlie might somehow come home, that there might still be a resolution that didn't end in grief. But as the weeks passed and the evidence mounted, those hopes had withered, replaced with an unbearable, aching certainty. Charlie was not coming back. For Kimberlyn Scott, her daughter's absence had become an ever-present wound, one that refused to close. The search efforts had not stopped, but they had changed. No longer was the family looking for a missing person. They were searching for remains. Searching for whatever was left of a woman who had once been vibrant, full of life, brimming with the anticipation of motherhood. The island of Maui had also changed. The whispers had turned into open accusations. People were watching Stephen Capobianco, studying him, dissecting his every movement. The once casual glances of neighbors and acquaintances had hardened into something else entirely. Suspicion, distrust, contempt. But none of it seemed to touch him. If he felt the weight of what was happening around him, he didn't show it. He still walked with the same careless stride, still wore that expression of quiet defiance, as though he was convinced none of this would touch him. And maybe for a moment, he had believed it wouldn't. Until law enforcement began moving in for the final pieces. They combed through his digital footprint, analyzing everything from phone records to online activity. His movements were tracked, dissected, analyzed with an intensity that left no stone unturned. And then, in the midst of this deep dive, something new surfaced. A message, Buried in the backlog of Charlie's phone records was a text exchange that had once seemed insignificant, but now carried chilling significance. Days before she disappeared, she had messaged a friend about Stephen. The words were simple, but they carried weight. "I think he's mad at me. He's been acting really weird lately." It was a small piece of the puzzle, but when placed within the context of everything else, it became yet another crack in the carefully constructed facade of Stephen's version of events. Then came the surveillance footage. It wasn't perfect, but it was damning. A grainy, low-resolution security camera from a private property along one of the island's more remote roads had captured a truck passing through in the early hours of the morning after Charlie was last seen. The timestamp didn't align with Stephen's version of events, and the truck? It looked exactly like his. It was enough. Detectives had been circling, watching, waiting. Now they were ready to make their move. The moment came swiftly. A warrant was issued. The team assembled. The tension in the air was electric. They knew they were stepping into something significant, something irreversible. When they arrived at his home, Stephen answered the door, the same blank expression on his face. But this time, the moment he saw the officers, the search team, the paperwork, something flickered in his eyes. For the first time, there was hesitation. For the first time, something cracked. They weren't here to ask questions anymore. They were here for answers. The sun hung low over the island, casting long shadows across the streets of Maui. For weeks, the tension had been building, a slow, suffocating force that wrapped itself around every corner of the community. The Scott family had long abandoned the fragile hope that Charlie might walk through their door again. The search for answers had become something darker, an unrelenting pursuit of justice, of finding out exactly what had happened to her in those final moments. Now the investigation had reached a breaking point. At the Maui Police Department, the weight of the case pressed against every officer working it. The crime scene evidence, forensic reports, phone records, and digital footprints had all led them to this moment. The warrant had been signed. There would be no more questioning, no more waiting for inconsistencies to reveal themselves. It was time to act. A group of detectives, flanked by uniformed officers, moved in formation towards Stephen Capobianco's residence. They had rehearsed this moment in their minds, anticipated every possible reaction. Would he deny everything? Would he try to run? Would he finally crack under pressure? The house sat in eerie stillness, a stark contrast to the turmoil about to unfold. The team approached with measured precision, their steps deliberate, controlled. An officer knocked on the door, firm but calm. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours before the door swung open. Stephen stood there, his face unreadable. He had always maintained an air of detachment, an almost practiced indifference to the gravity of the situation. But today something had changed. The moment his eyes flicked between the officers, the warrant, the cuffs in one of their hands, his expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. It was the smallest crack in the mask he had so carefully constructed. "Stephen Capobianco, you are under arrest for the murder of Carly Scott," an officer announced, voice even, unwavering. For a beat, there was no reaction. Then came the smallest twitch at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smirk, not quite a frown, just a flicker of something unidentifiable. The officers moved in, restraining him swiftly, their hands firm against his arms as the cold steel of the handcuffs locked into place. The reality of the moment settled like a stone in the air. The man who had spent weeks walking freely, the man who had shown no emotion, no fear, was now being led toward the waiting patrol car. Onlookers had begun to gather. Neighbors stood at a distance, whispering, watching. Some held their phones up, recording, capturing the moment that the island had been waiting for. There were no words of protest from Stephen, no outburst, no denial. Just silence. As he was placed into the vehicle, a single question hung in the air, unspoken but deafening in its presence. Where was Charlie? The ride back to the station was uneventful. Stephen didn't speak, didn't shift in his seat. His hands, now bound in front of him, rested motionless in his lap. There was no panic, no pleading. If he was afraid, he didn't show it. If he felt regret, it was buried too deep to see. At the station, he was led through the familiar halls, but this time, he was not here as a witness, not as someone being questioned. He was now the suspect in a murder case, the focus of an investigation that had gripped an entire community. In the interrogation room, the walls closed in. The dim, artificial lighting cast sharp shadows, and the air was thick with something unseen. The officers were prepared for what would come next. They had studied men like him before, men who thought they were smarter than the system, men who believed that if they kept their stories straight, if they refused to acknowledge the inevitable, they could somehow slip through the cracks. But the cracks were gone. The evidence against him was no longer circumstantial. It was physical. It was undeniable. They presented him with the DNA findings, the strands of Charlie's hair in his truck, the blood that, though faint, was hers, the surveillance footage placing his vehicle in areas he had claimed never to have been. For the first time since the beginning of this case, Stephen seemed to hesitate, but hesitation was not confession, and so he sat there in silence. Hours passed. The detectives pressed, but Stephen remained unmoved. He answered some questions, but only in the same clipped, detached manner he always had. He offered no explanations, no new information. He refused to say where Charlie was. The silence in that room was a different kind of violence. Meanwhile, outside the station, the news of his arrest had spread like wildfire. Reporters gathered, camera crews set up, headlines scrolled across TV screens. The case had been big before, but now it was national. People who had never heard Charlie Scott's name before now spoke it, demanded justice for her. Her mother, Kimberlyn, watched it all unfold with an expression that was difficult to read. She had wanted this moment. She had fought for it. But it was not the end, not yet, because Stephen Capobianco was in custody, but Charlie Scott was still missing. And until she was found, the fight was far from over. The days following Stephen Capobianco's arrest were filled with a chaotic energy that spread beyond the walls of the police station, reaching every home, every media outlet, every conversation held in hushed, urgent tones. The island of Maui, a place that had long thrived on its close-knit sense of community, was now engulfed in a chilling reality. One of their own was missing, and another was behind bars, accused of unspeakable violence. But an arrest was not a conviction. Law enforcement had built their case carefully, methodically, piece by piece, but they knew what lay ahead would be a different kind of battle. The court system was not like the world outside. In the court system, everything had to be proven, innocent until proven guilty. It was a phrase that echoed through the hallways of the courthouse as the prosecution prepared for what would be one of the most closely watched trials in Hawaii's recent history. The burden of proof was on them, and while the evidence against Stephen was substantial, it was still circumstantial. They had hair fibers, traces of blood, digital footprints, surveillance footage, all pointing to Stephen as the last person to see Charlie alive. But they were missing one crucial piece: her body. Without a body, there was no definitive cause of death. No exact moment in time to pinpoint the crime. The defense would use this against them. They would argue that Charlie was not dead, only missing. That without her remains, everything else was speculation. It was a strategy that had worked before, but the prosecution wasn't going to let that happen. From the moment the trial date was set, the attorneys worked relentlessly, analyzing every detail, every inconsistency, every lie Stephen had told. They knew that winning this case meant exposing the cracks in his carefully constructed narrative, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hide behind. The public interest in the trial was overwhelming. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters lining the benches, their notebooks filled with shorthand scribbles that would later turn into breaking news headlines. People wanted justice. They wanted to see Stephen Capobianco answer for what had happened to Charlie. And so, the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time in setting the tone. They painted a picture, one of a woman who had trusted the wrong person, a woman who had believed she was helping someone who, in reality, had lured her to her death. They spoke of the DNA evidence, of the strands of hair found in Stephen's truck, of the surveillance footage that placed his vehicle in locations he had never mentioned. They broke down his timeline, pointing out every inconsistency, every lie, until what had once seemed like a simple story of a woman driving off into the night became something darker, more insidious. They called Charlie's family to the stand. Kimberlyn Scott, her mother, was composed but visibly shattered. She spoke of her daughter's excitement about her pregnancy, of the last conversation they had, of the moment she knew in her heart that something was wrong. She described the days of searching, the dread that had settled in when they found Charlie's burned-out vehicle. And finally, she spoke of the moment the police told her that her daughter's DNA had been found in Stephen's truck. Her voice cracked, just slightly, but she held herself together. When she stepped down from the witness stand, the weight in the room was palpable. Next came the forensic experts. They explained how fire was used to destroy evidence, how the accelerant patterns on Charlie's car indicated an intentional act. They broke down the traces of blood, explaining how, though faint, they were conclusive. They showed the jury the strands of red hair, explaining how they had become lodged in Stephen's truck in a way that suggested force, not casual transfer. The prosecution left nothing to chance. Then it was Stephen's turn. The defense had one job: to create doubt. They argued that without a body, there was no proof that a crime had been committed. They claimed that Charlie could have run away, that she might have been the victim of some unknown third party. They suggested that Stephen's behavior, though cold, was not evidence of guilt. Stephen himself sat before the jury, his demeanor eerily similar to what it had been since the beginning. Unmoved, indifferent, as if none of this truly mattered to him. He denied everything. "I didn't kill Charlie." Those were his words, but the evidence told another story. As the trial continued, a new twist emerged, one that no one had expected. A former acquaintance of Stephen came forward with a chilling revelation. He testified that, months before Charlie disappeared, Stephen had made an offhand comment, something that had seemed meaningless at the time, but now took on an entirely different meaning. "She's ruining my life," Stephen had allegedly said. "I wish she would just disappear." The prosecution pounced on it. They asked the jury to consider that this was not just a crime of impulse. This had been premeditated. Stephen had wanted Charlie gone, and when she refused to let him escape the responsibility of fatherhood, he made sure she wouldn't be around anymore. The jury listened, and slowly the weight of it all began to settle in. As the final days of the trial approached, the prosecution delivered their closing arguments. They reminded the jury of everything they had heard, of everything they had seen. They left them with one final thought. Charlie Scott didn't vanish. She was taken, and the man who took her is sitting in this courtroom. Then the world waited. The jury deliberated for days. The Scott family barely breathed. The island held its collective breath. And finally, the verdict was in. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that didn't just exist in sound, but in the tension that gripped the air, thick and suffocating. The kind of silence that came before something irrevocable, something final. 12 jurors sat in their designated places, their expressions unreadable, their collective decision hidden behind the weight of their solemn duty. They had spent days behind closed doors, sifting through mountains of evidence, testimonies filled with raw grief, and forensic details so precise they left little room for misinterpretation. They had argued, debated, questioned every piece of the case, and now they had reached the moment that would define the fate of Stephen Capobianco. He sat at the defense table, still as stone. No nervous twitching, no signs of fear. The same man who had sat through every painful, heartbreaking testimony from Charlie Scott's family without so much as a flinch. The same man who had heard experts lay out damning forensic evidence with the expression of someone listening to a dull weather report. And yet, in this moment, this singular, irreversible moment, something in his eyes flickered. The judge, an older woman with a face hardened by years of seeing the best and worst of humanity, looked at the foreperson of the jury. She gave a small nod. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A collective breath seemed to hold in the room as the foreperson, a man in his 50s with an expression that betrayed the weight of what he was about to say, rose to his feet, a folded slip of paper trembling slightly in his hands. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying the gravity of what had been decided. "We have, Your Honor." The judge motioned for the paper to be handed over. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the words before lifting them toward the defendant. There was no emotion in her face, no indication of what was written. She turned back to the jury. In the matter of the state of Hawaii versus Stephen Capobianco, how do you find the defendant? The words came steady, unwavering, absolute. Guilty. There was no immediate reaction from Stephen. His face remained blank, his posture unchanged. But in the seats behind him, the sound of muffled sobs broke through the stillness. Kimberlyn Scott closed her eyes. A long, shuddering breath escaped her lips, her fingers gripping the armrest of her seat as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Fiona, Charlie's younger sister, pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wet with tears that had been held back for too long. They had waited for this moment. They had suffered through every agonizing second of the trial, reliving the worst nightmare of their lives in excruciating detail. And now, finally, they had a word that carried meaning. Guilty. The judge nodded once before turning back to the jury. And in regard to the charge of second-degree arson, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. It was another blow, another weight dropped onto Stephen Capobianco's shoulders, yet still, he did not move. The judge let the verdict settle before she addressed the room. Mr. Capobianco, you have been found guilty of murder in the second degree and arson in the second degree. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. The gavel came down with a resounding thud, and just like that, it was over. For the Scott family, it was closure, but not peace, because justice did not erase the fact that Charlie was still gone, that her unborn child had been stolen from a life that never had the chance to begin, that somewhere out there, in a place only he knew, her remains still lay undiscovered, waiting for someone to find them. Stephen Capobianco had not just killed Charlie Scott, he had erased her, or at least he had tried. The days after the verdict were filled with reactions that rippled through the island and beyond. Reporters flooded the streets, broadcasting the outcome to a captivated public. Some called it a victory. Others called it bittersweet justice. But for those closest to the case, it was simply an ending that left more questions than answers. The biggest question of all: would he ever reveal where she was? Law enforcement knew the truth. The case was strong, the conviction secured, but they also knew something darker. People like Stephen Capobianco didn't confess. They didn't break. They didn't offer redemption in the form of an apology or an admission of guilt. They let the silence speak for them. And so, despite the guilty verdict, despite the weight of the justice system pressing down on him, Stephen remained silent. He did not tell the Scott family where Charlie's body was. He did not acknowledge the pain he had caused. He simply let the world move around him, as though none of it truly touched him. At sentencing, the judge did not hold back. She handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the arson charge. It was the harshest punishment available under Hawaii law. And yet, to some, it still wasn't enough, because a sentence wasn't a body, a verdict wasn't a burial, a conviction wasn't closure. The Scott family walked out of the courtroom with the weight of justice behind them, but also the unshakable, unbearable knowledge that Charlie was still somewhere out there, waiting to be found. Days turned into weeks, then weeks into months. The case faded from national headlines, but for those who loved Charlie, it would never be forgotten. The search for her remains never stopped. Volunteers combed through remote areas, hoping for even the smallest sign, but each passing day made the chances of finding her seem more impossible. Still, they searched, because until she was found, there would never be an end. And Stephen Capobianco? He sat in his prison cell, the walls closing in around him, but never speaking a word. Not about that night, not about what he had done, and certainly not about where he had left her. The trial had ended, the verdict had been delivered, and Stephen Capobianco had been sentenced to life in prison. The justice system had done what it could, what it was designed to do. But for Charlie Scott's family, the end of the legal battle did not bring the peace that so many had expected, because justice and closure were not the same thing. Justice was a conviction, a sentence, a court ruling that declared, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the man responsible for Charlie's disappearance and death had been found guilty. Closure, however, required something else. Closure meant knowing where she was. It meant bringing her home. And that was something no judge, no jury, No prosecutor could give them. Only one person held the key to that truth, and he refused to speak. The search for Charlie never truly stopped. In the weeks following the trial, volunteers continued to scour remote parts of Maui, hoping to find any trace of her. The rugged terrain, once a paradise, now felt like a vast, impenetrable maze hiding a terrible secret. The cliffs, the dense forests, the hidden ravines, all places where a body could be concealed, where the elements could strip away evidence, where time could erase the final proof of what had been done. But hope, in whatever fragile form it still existed, would not allow them to stop looking. Kimberlyn Scott, Charlie's mother, became the voice of that relentless hope. She refused to let the world forget. She spoke at vigils. She stood in front of cameras. She demanded that people remember her daughter not as a crime statistic, but as a human being, a daughter, a sister, an expectant mother who had been robbed of her future. The island had changed because of this case. People whispered about it in stores, in coffee shops, in late-night conversations that ended in quiet shakes of the head. The fear that had once existed, the fear that something terrible had happened to Charlie, had been replaced by something else. Rage, disgust, and an unshakable sense of loss. Maui was a place where things like this weren't supposed to happen, a place where community meant something, where people took care of one another. Charlie's murder had shattered that illusion. It had reminded them all that monsters did not only exist in faraway places, sometimes they lived right next door. Inside the walls of his prison cell, Stephen Capobianco remained as silent as ever. The same man who had sat through an entire trial with an air of indifference now lived in a space no bigger than a walk-in closet, surrounded by concrete and steel. He had no control, no power, no way to manipulate those around him as he once had. The world outside continued without him, his name now nothing more than a stain on Maui's history. But even in prison, he refused to answer the one question that mattered most. Where was Charlie? The Scott family knew that, barring some miracle, they would likely never get the answer. Stephen was the kind of man who would rather let the truth rot inside him than offer a shred of relief to those he had hurt. And so Charlie remained missing. Her absence was felt in every moment, in every breath her family took. It was in the empty chair at the dinner table, in the untouched nursery that had once been filled with plans for a future that would never come. It was in the quiet nights when her mother still expected to hear her voice, in the dreams where she was alive, laughing, unaware of the fate that had stolen her away. Closure was supposed to mean letting go. But how do you let go when there is nothing left to hold on to? The years passed, but Charlie's name never faded. Her story became one of caution, of heartbreak, of the danger of trusting the wrong person. Her case was taught in criminology courses, discussed in forensic psychology studies. She became a symbol, not just of what had been lost, but of the fight to never let her be forgotten. Kimberlyn Scott continued to speak out, turning her grief into a mission. She fought for victims' families, for missing persons cases that didn't get the same media attention as her daughters had. She stood before lawmakers, advocating for better protections for pregnant women in abusive situations. She refused to let Charlie's story end with silence. And Stephen Capobianco? He remained in prison, forgotten by the world, remembered only as a name in a case that had changed everything. He had stolen Charlie's life, but he could never erase her. This case was more than just a murder. It was a story about power, control, and the devastating consequences of unchecked violence. It was a reminder that justice, even when served, does not always bring closure, and it was a testament to the resilience of those left behind, the ones who refuse to stop searching, even when the rest of the world moves on. Some stories end with justice, others end with truth, but some, like Charlie Scott's, never truly end at all. Because until she is found, she is still out there, waiting to come home. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.